Okay, welcome everyone to our latest and greatest BCCN talk. Today it's a real pleasure to have with us Professor Adam Liu. He's an assistant professor at the Kuan School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. And he's trained in political science, but sees himself very much as an interdisciplinary person. And that's really reflected in his work. Prior to coming to us here, he was presenting at the DIW in Berlin to a group of economists. So his work has wide reach beyond political science. So his PhD was at Stanford in his dissertation on building markets within authoritarian institutions, the political economy of banking development in China, won no less than the 2020 BRICS Economic Research Award, a very big deal, and again, another sign of his influence beyond political science. I know Adam for quite a long time now. Before Stanford, he did his undergraduate training at the University of Toronto, where I did my PhD, and we overlapped in Toronto, actually, I think now.
In Shanghai.
In Beijing,
right.
Yeah, that's right. And also, Adam was very gracious to host me in his hometown in Dongbei. And I took home a great big bag of delicious rice that sustained me through my lean PhD days. So, I owe you and your family a great debt going back to that. So it's a real pleasure to have with us Adam, and also a personal pleasure for me to see what great successes our former students have flown to. And today he's going to be talking about his recent his book project on Beijing's banking balloon. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Adam. Wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah, for that very kind introduction. Sarah didn't mention the fact that she was my TA when I was an undergrad student at U of T. So last time we saw each other was 14 years ago, back in 2009. So it's great to be in Berlin. This is my first time in Berlin, and to talk about this. This is also my first time to talk about this sort of book project. As Sarah mentioned, I was presenting my more sort of technical stuff to the economists a few days ago in Berlin. But this is an overarching view of what I'm trying to accomplish in this book. I'm trying to write a book that's more accessible to the general audience than specialists who only study banking in China. So for those of you, I assume that most of you care about and follow development in China, Chinese politics, Chinese economy. That's why you're here. So for those of you who follow stories about what's going on in China, I'm sure you won't be surprised by the fact that if you read newspapers around the world, it seems to be the case that the Chinese economy is really doing very badly. Just about 2 years ago, there was a major homeowner protests against this gigantic real estate company called Evergrande. It was all over the headlines in the world. And last year, there was also a major protests in Henan province by depositors. So these are depositors who are not able to retrieve their money from those so-called village and township banks in Henan province. And amidst all of this, we also know that the Chinese government has been cracking down on the private sector and even dismantling some of them, such as the famous Tomorrow Group. And even worse, if you read stories about the Chinese economy in the recent few months, we know that local government debt is still a very big problem in China, and even worse, local revenue is shrinking. So the question is, why are all of these problems festering at the same time? Is this a pure coincidence? A lot of people say that, look, over the past few years, there's been a trade war between China and the United States, and this sort of worsening relationship between China and the West in general is a cause of these domestic problems. But more people attribute to China's recent problems to President Xi Jinping, to his anti-market policies. I think both views have merits, but I think they only touch sort of the surface of the problem in China nowadays. I think the root problem of what China is facing today really lies in a kind of, for the sake of lacking a better word now, it's a sort of state-owned market system that the Chinese Communist Party has been trying to create or has ended up with in the reform era. It's a system which looks very peculiar to the outside world because it's a system where both competitive and government allocations of resources exist, where profits and politics both dictate, and where party discipline and market discipline both matter. And so it's a very peculiar system where the visible hand of the party state tries to both create and hold the invisible hand of the market. And I would say that such a system is most clearly at work in the country's gigantic banking system. For those of you who don't know, in terms of assets, China's banking system is by far the largest in the world. The total banking assets in China accounts for about 40% of global GDP, even if we try to measure the size of the system in terms of GDP. And specifically, I'm going to argue that a process of state-engineered market development in the banking system lies at the very heart of China's very fast economic development over the past 3 decades, and also at the heart of its current problems. So it's a Janus-faced, it's two sides of the same coin. So over time, once you start taking this class, you will learn that a lot of people, they are pessimists, they are optimists when they look at the Chinese economy, but I think they are looking, over time, people have been looking at two sides of the same coin. And why do I say that this sort of state-engineered process of market development in the banking sector is at the heart of both China's success and potential crises? I explain why that's the case in the rest of the talk. So just to give you a sense of this I would say, exponential proliferation of banks in the Chinese system over time. So here's a map. If you can see that map, there are some red dots. These red dots are bank headquarters in China in 1994. So these are just headquarters, they don't cover branches. So back in 1994, there were about 14 banks in China. We don't see 14 points because most of the banks headquarters are clustered in Beijing. So there are dots on top of each other. So we don't see 14 dots. And these are large banks like Bank of China, Construction Bank of China. So for those of you who don't know the background, in China there are 4 giant state-owned banks. Bank of China, Construction Bank of China, Commercial Industry Bank of China, Agricultural Bank of China. So typically when people talk about the Chinese banking system, the conventional wisdom, oh, there are just 4 large state-owned banks in China, period. But the story has changed very rapidly over time. So moving forward to around 2014-15, almost every single locality in China has a bank headquarters of its own. Again, this doesn't cover all the branches because I think if we show the branches, there are about 230,000 branches in 2015. So you get a sense of this exponential proliferation of banks in China. Now, why is that the case? A lot of economists, they would say that this isn't puzzling. If you look at Chinese data over time, everything in China looks like this, right? There's this growth and so on and so forth. But this is still very peculiar in the sense that in such a system, why would you need so many banks? So because this is in the first part of the book, I would try to argue that this is really not a natural phenomenon of what economists call financial development, because they would say, oh, when there are, when China just began economic reform in 1978, which you guys should know about, because private entrepreneurs need money and state-owned banks don't lend to them. So over time, there will be smaller banks, entering the system and try to provide firms and especially private firms and entrepreneurs with capital that they need for growth. But this is really not the story, because in China, what happened is a political story. In short, well, I will tell you the political story in just a minute. So this is one bank in China. So let me backward a little bit. So these financial institutions, these little dots, they are not private banks. They are all state-owned or state-controlled. And they are state-owned or state-controlled by varying levels of the Chinese government. And I call these little dots local state banks. I would say that over the past 30 years, these local state banks have been the wildest animals in the Chinese economy. They've been expanding so dramatically that when we think about the market share of the big state banks, the big four banks that I just mentioned, so the big four banks used to control about 100%. They were the banking system in the early years of reform. But nowadays, because of the exponential proliferation of these local state banks, the market share of the big four has gone down to about 25 to 30%. So it's a dramatic evolution of a state-centered banking system, right? So basically, there's no privatization of the Chinese banking system. There's no liberalization, yet there's this dramatic transformation of the system within, I would say, within boundaries of the party state. And let me just give you one example of these little local state banks. It's called Baoshan Bank. This bank was, its headquarters was in Inner Mongolia. The bank had already collapsed in 2019. So if you Google Baoshan Bank, I'm pretty sure you can still find a lot of stories about how the bank developed, how the bank failed. It declared bankruptcy, I think, around 2019 with the permission of the central government. So that's another story. So basically in China, all these banks, they can't declare bankruptcy themselves. They got to get permission from the upper levels. So it's not a firm level kind of a decision. So this bank, what I show here is sort of the over time expansion of this one particular bank in Inner Mongolia from the late 1990s to around 2019, 2020. And on the vertical axis, these just the number of branches that the bank used to own. So clearly there are three phases to the development of this bank, and I would say to the development of local state banks more generally. So there's the entry phase, there is the boom phase, and there's the bust phase. So Baoshan has been one of the first to declare bankruptcy in the Chinese banking industry in recent years, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are more coming later, but we can discuss that later during Q&A. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to do the following things. Now, first, I will try to talk a little bit about why was there such a dramatic expansion or proliferation of local state banks. And then I'll talk a little bit about how did it happen, because by the time when these local state banks started to enter the markets, which was around the mid-1990s, the big four had already saturated the market. They had branches all over the place. So how did these smaller local state banks manage to compete and in many localities, really squeeze the margins of the big banks? And then I will talk a little bit about sort of some of the consequences of this transformation of the Chinese banking system, and try to link this to the real estate sector and local government debt, just very briefly. And then I'll try to conclude with some my current thoughts about, so what does this tell us about Chinese model, if there's a model of development? So why did this happen? Again, I would say that there has been this exponential proliferation of the banking institution in China, not because of natural financial development, but because of what I call a political grand bargain between central government and local governments in the mid-1990s. I've written a paper with my former advisor and one more other colleague about this particular grand bargain. So basically, the short story is that later on you will know this guy. I'm pretty sure this is China's former Prime Minister Zhu Rongji. He's still alive, I think. So basically, in the mid-1990s, he did a major fiscal reform because the central government had a major problem with revenue, because if you can see here, the dashed line here is the share of national revenue controlled by local governments. So in 1993, local government in China controlled about 78% of the national revenue. And the central government was only controlling about 22% of the country's national revenue. And a lot of Chinese scholars at the time would say that we have to change this because there are cases where, in other countries, where this high level of fiscal decentralization could create political challenges for the central government down the road. So this guy, who was the vice premier at the time, really re-centralized over the fiscal system, because in 1994, he brought down the level of local revenue share from 78% to about 45%. But then, here's the question. That left the localities with a big fiscal gap, because their spending responsibilities wasn't changed. They still have to pay their bills with much less revenue. So how did this guy manage to solicit local support for this dramatic fiscal centralization? The standard answers in the literature, which are all right, I'm not saying that what scholars have been saying are wrong, are that there was schemes of tax returns. He promised fiscal transfers, both general and earmark transfers, to help out localities. If you read his memoirs, I enjoy reading these people's memoirs, which is very valuable. He promised localities with you guys can have total spending autonomy. So basically, I think he said something to the effect that I don't really care about how you spend your money. I don't even care about how you raise your money. I only care about how much the central government gets. Remember, that was a time when the central government was only getting about 22% of the revenue. So he really cares about the central share of revenue. And of course, he promised localities, you guys can keep selling land. However, I think up to now, scholars have really missed one big piece of the sort of the grand bargain, of the quid pro quo that Beijing was trying to offer, which is allowing the local governments to set up their own banks. And this promise was brought up by Zhu Rongji, I think at least 2 to 3 times when he was traveling around the country in 1983 trying to convince local leaders that this fiscal reform wouldn't hurt your ability to develop the economy that much, because you guys will be having your own banks. That's why we see that. So here, this dark line shows the over time, the sort of the number of major local state banks in China. We see that there is a clear spike right after 1994. So basically, most of the big local state banks in China, they were all set up right after the fiscal reform during this period of time. And also there was a bit of a story about re-centralization of the big four banks, which we can talk about during the Q&A, but I don't want to complicate the story too much. But basically the short message here is that there was a bit of a quid pro quo going on. And that's sort of the origin of Chinese bank proliferation, because if it were a natural story of financial development, why do we see this unusual, sudden rise in the number of banks in China? So let's go back to this Baoshan Bank graph. I'm going to come back to this graph again and again. You might think, okay, so the Baoshan Bank was created in 1998 in Inner Mongolia as part of this wave of bank creation. How come they started with 51 branches right away? Is that a sort of a measurement problem in my data set? And why didn't they build more branches up to 2005? They started with 51 branches because they were taking over existing so-called urban credit unions that were under the control of central government. So basically, when Zhu Rongji made a promise to local governments, okay, you guys can create your own banks, he even promised localities, you can take over some of our urban credit unions as your starting assets, basically. So that's why they started off with 51 branches right away. And the number of branches didn't change for quite a number of years because the central government didn't allow them to set up more branches until around 2005 when Beijing started to allow these banks to set up branches within their locality, even outside their city and even outside their provinces. So that's a later story. So that's why we see they had 51 branches to begin with. Now, the second question is, once these local state banks were in markets, how did they compete? Because they didn't enter a markets where, so basically they entered a market where the big four banks had been in operation for many years. And the big four banks, they had branches all over the place. So how did they compete? How did they grow? There are a few factors that I would say help explain the expansion. Now we are moving on to the expansion part of the story. There are a few factors that help with sort of the expansion of these local state banks. One, I would say bank entrepreneurialism, and the second term is from my advisor, local state corporatism. I feel obligated to use that, even though she's not here, I'm very scared of her, and then political competition across localities. So basically now we are moving on to this part of the story. So that's the entry part, and this is the expansion part. I'm trying to explain how did this happen. So who are the bosses of these local state banks? These are folks who used to work at the big four banks, as well as the central bank. So these were super entrepreneurial individuals because in the mid-1990s, it was actually a very brief decision to leave the old system and to blaze a new trail because everybody thought, okay, you are working for the big four, that's such a great job. It's not only an iron rice bowl, it's just like a golden iron rice bowl. Why would you leave the old banking system and to start and to join something that you don't know what's going to happen to these local state banks? So by self-selection, all these, the founding directors, the founding managers of these local state banks were actually very entrepreneurial, and I met quite a few of them, and they are very smart. They're very smart individuals. They know how to navigate the system, and they know how to play the local games better than anyone else can do. Also, these banks had to compete very fiercely because from day one, they were in this sort of existential crisis. Because, as I said, they were facing a situation where the market was already pretty much saturated by the Big Four. So they had to really compete as fiercely as they could, and in order to not just thrive, but survive in the first place. And of course, because these local state banks, you can think of them as basically as local SOEs to a large extent, they had exceptional support from local governments. They're real bosses behind the curtain. For example, local governments would provide fiscal support. In their early years, these banks receive large sum of money from local governments. Basically, they deposit their revenue into these banks to help them get started. And this is part of the local corporate story going on. Local governments coordinated with local SOEs and other work units. This is a term that you will learn about that way in the Chinese system. They coordinate everyone. So you guys, we have all, you all have to use these local state banks. You have to set up your payroll system with them, and so on and so forth. So basically, local governments are trying to coordinate everyone within their locality to help these banks grow. Local governments even engaged in what I call constructive extractions in order to help these banks grow. For example, local government officials would come to some local private firms. Could you please borrow from the bank? Even if the firm don't need the money at the moment. Because by borrowing from the banks, that makes their balance sheet look good. So that helps beef up their balance sheets. And in some localities, I even know that because you guys know that there's been a religious revival in China. Chinese people have been donating a lot of money to temples. So local governments have been even trying to snatch these local religious donations and put them into these banks. Again, all to help these banks to grow. And with such support, these local state banks have been very aggressive themselves in terms of expanding their local markets, and they've been engaged in all kinds of what I call market campaigns. This is another term that you will come across, I'm sure. Campaign, mobilization in Chinese politics. So I would say that they engage in all sorts of market campaigns. Parachuting their employees into different corners of the city, try to set up their booth and attract, depositors and so on and so forth. Especially trying to sell their wealth management products to, old aunties and uncles who have nothing to do but try to find new ways of making money. And these local state banks have also engaged in all sorts of policy arbitrage. So basically trying to poke, where are the regulatory holes in the system where I can leverage in order to further expand. So for example, remember in the beginning of the talk I mentioned that there was a protest going on, protest by depositors in Henan province against these so-called village and township banks. So village and township banks, when you hear the name village, township, they are meant to be rural financial institutions. And they came into existence mostly during the Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao era. That's Xi Jinping's predecessor. So that was from 2002 to 2012. That was a period when the Chinese government was really was trying to focus on rural development, and the government was trying to encourage banks in China to set up subsidiaries in rural areas in order to better promote agricultural development and rural development. Okay, and then these local state banks in cities saw the opportunity they try to apply licenses from the central government. Yes, yes, of course, this is a great idea. Please give me a license that will set up branches in villages. They got licenses, but they didn't set up these branches in rural areas. Instead, they still plug them into urban core areas in order to, so basically they treated them as another bank branch to attract even more deposits in the urban areas. I don't think you can see this clearly. So this is, I've been talking about Baoshan Bank, right? Baoshan Bank. It was located in the city of Baotou in Mongolia. So this is the sort of the downtown area of the city, and this is their development zone. So just by looking at the sort of the downtown area, there are a variety of banks. You can't see this, so you have to trust me. So these orangish dots are all village township banks created by Baoshan Bank. Yet, when you actually look at the data very carefully, they all cluster in, there are a few orange dots here and there, but most of them are clustered in the urban core, despite the fact that these licenses are meant to set up rural banks. So, at the moment you might be thinking, okay, so if you were a party secretary in a Chinese city, if you were a mayor in Baotou or in any Chinese city, you might be thinking, oh, I should really try to monopolize local financial resources. I should try to, basically make my own local state bank the monopoly within my locality. But I would say that's what I thought. But based on my research, that wasn't the case actually. And local officials neither had the capacity nor the incentive to make their local state banks into local monopolies. And here's why. Most local officials in China stay within their locality for just about 3, 4, 5 years, for a relatively short period of time. Then they will be rotated into a different locality. So they don't really have the incentive, to work really, really hard to turn these local state banks into local monopolies. And also it would be really hard to do because there's an upper limit to basically how much these local state banks can steal from the Big Four. Because the Big Four banks in China still remain sort of the most trustworthy financial institutions in the eyes of ordinary Chinese. So the incentive of local officials have been trying to aggrandize rather than monopolize their local financial resources. And that's why local officials have kept really an open door policy. So basically, other than supporting their own banks, the local state bank within their locality, they have also actively invited other banks to enter their home markets. For example, if you are if you are the city mayor of Beijing, the capital city in China, you would invite a bank from Shanghai, from Tianjin, from other places. Come over, set up new branches in my place. And there's a reason, because whenever banks from outside a locality enters, they have to pay an entry premium, basically. So they have to sign these so-called strategic partnerships with local governments. This is a signing ceremony of a local government in Henan province with the provincial level local state bank in the province. So basically, these strategic partnerships, basically they mean that, okay, we welcome you to come in and set up branches and attract deposits within my locality, but we have to sign a contract. In the next 3 years, you have basically, within my tenure here, in the next 3 years, you have to make extra amount of loan to these set of enterprises that I choose, I picked. So basically, all these banks have to pay an entry premium. So this is sort of the underlying political logic of market expansion in China. So when economists look at this, oh, you know, these banks are trying to, they're not necessarily following, you know, market logics. These local state banks grew fast also because of performance evaluation. If you are a city mayor in China or a party secretary, every year you'll be evaluated. Like now I'm teaching in Singapore. Every year I am evaluated by my school. So how many publications have you produced in the past year? How many talks like this have you been giving overseas over the past year? So for local government officials, they are evaluated every year. So what's your growth number last year? And what's, you know, how many new investment have you attracted? So this is a, you know, in many localities in China, local financial development has also been part and parcel of their annual evaluation. So, you know, for example, this guy, who is China's #1 banking regulator, he used to be the governor of a province in China, Shandong province. So when he was the governor of Shandong province, he made local financial development a big part of the evaluation system in that province. So therefore, you know, if you were a city mayor in that province, you would be trying really hard to grow your local state banks and also try to invite other local state banks to come into your localities to set up branches. Ironically, later on when he became the regulator, he had to deal with these local state banks that he encouraged to set up in the first place. Now, consequences. How am I doing on time? I should try to. Okay, so consequences. This is sort of one of the last things I would say. So with this sort of very dramatic expansion of China's local state banks, so what are some of the big consequences? The first is, as I said, the large national central state-owned banks, their market share has really dramatically been reduced from almost 100% in the early years of Chinese reform down to about 25% or so. Just about a quarter of the commercial banking system, which is a huge, it's a huge story that a lot of people have missed. And needless to say, there's been intense competition in the Chinese banking system, despite the fact it's still a state-dominated system. If you talk to Chinese bankers, the single word that they like to use all the time is competition. But we have to know that this is still a system where the role of private and, I mean, genuinely private banks and foreign banks are still quite small, even negligible if we think about this. So this is just another map that shows sort of the dramatic sort of shrinking of the Big Four's market share. So these are branches basically. Let's just look at this one. So what this shows is that other than Tibet, so Tibet is the only sort of region in China where the Big Four still controls over 50% of the local bank branches. Okay, and for the rest of the country, you know, sort of the branches controlled by the Big Four banks accounts for about 25 to 30%. So roughly 0.25, roughly a quarter. So this corresponds to the story that the assets of the Big Four has dropped to around 25 to 30%. So another key consequence is that these local state banks have really become a key pillar of local economy. So that's why it's really hard to regulate them at this moment because they're so important in the local economy. If President Xi Jinping wants to really strengthen regulation of the over the banking system, then he has to think really hard about, okay, then who should be playing the role of these local state banks if we try to shut them down or if we try to strengthen regulation of them. Because over the past 2 decades or so, these local state banks have been really supporting local private sector development. You know, of course, these local state banks have been doing many things that are not necessarily within, you know, that are not necessarily consistent with government regulations. I mean, some of the stuff that they've been doing might be illegal, but in terms of sort of the welfare implications, they've been really important for private sector development in China because these big 4 banks controlled by the central government, they don't like to lend to private sector because they have a long history of dealing with SOEs and they're happy with their SOE buddies. There's a scholar whose name is Nicholas Lardy, who is one of the most seasoned observers of China's financial system. In 2014, he wrote a book called Markets Over Mao. And he showed this picture in his book. Basically, he was looking at 2010, 2011, 2012 data. And for these 3 years for which he had data, he was surprised to find that the private sector, private firms in China were actually getting more new bank lending than the state sector. So basically, in the book, he was saying, look, it's really not correct anymore that the state sector receives more lending from banks because look, in 2010, 2011, 2012, the data suggests that private firms in China were getting more new bank lending from the banking system. And he sort of hinted at the possibility that it is the local state banks, these regional, what he calls regional state banks, regional banks that were helping local private firms. And in my own work, I tried to test the sort of the hypothesis that whether or not the expansion of the local state banks have been conducive to private sector development. And what this chart shows you very intuitively is that I try to see sort of the correlation between local state bank expansion and big 4 bank expansion in terms of their total assets, and correlate that with local private investment. What this shows you, there are 2 messages. One is that Big 4 is not friendly to private sector investment. So the more dominant the Big 4 is, the less private investment there will be within Chinese cities. So this is, I should say, this is data from 2007 to 2015 at the province level. But the expansion of local state banks correlate positively with local private sector investment. Another key consequence of the rise of local state banks is that the fact that they are local state banks, they have to help with local governments.
Okay.
So, you guys heard of, you probably haven't heard of this yet. In China, local governments cannot borrow from banks themselves. It's illegal. So local governments in China have been very creative. They created a set of firms, because firms can borrow from banks. So they created a set of firms called local government financing vehicle companies. And these local government financing vehicle companies have been borrowing and issuing bonds on behalf of local governments for mostly local infrastructure development. And so who are lending to and who are buying the bonds issued by these local government financing vehicle companies? I would say mostly local state banks. And what this shows is, again, the correlation between the size of local state bank sector in 2013 and the size of local government debt. They are highly positively correlated with each other. Another sort of very simple charts that suggests that local government banks have been lending a lot to local government financing vehicles is that this is so-called bank holdings of local government bonds. Citibanks, rural banks account for about 95%, 94%. And the big national banks only about 6 or 7%. And so this is sort of the period when we come back to the picture about the one particular local state bank, Baoshan. You know, all of these are sort of the expansion period, mostly during the, especially during the financial crisis period. You know, there was a financial crisis in 2008, and what China did is to do this sort of $4 trillion stimulus package. As a matter of fact, I think the real number is much bigger than 4 trillion. And the local state banks played a big role in the stimulus story. The city-level local state banks alone accounted for about 50% of the money that local governments raised during the financial crisis. A story that, again, most people tend to sort of overlook. So another sort of key consequence is that before the recent central government sort of strengthening of regulation of the real estate sector, these local state banks have been pouring money into local real estate firms. Again, we look at sort of the size of local state banks and local real estate investment. They are, you know, they are super, super highly correlated with each other. Economically speaking, it made a lot of sense for these banks to lend to the property sector because over the past 10 years it was just still booming and it was profitable to lend to the property sector. But politically speaking, it also made sense from the point of view of local government because local governments need these real estate firms to keep buying land from local governments. And where would these real estate firms to get the money to in the first place? A lot of them go to local state banks. Why don't they go to the large national banks, the big four banks? Because it's much easier. The sort of the loan application process, the approval process is much easier, much faster with these local state banks than getting a loan from the large national, the big four banks. Because for the big four banks, they had to report to the province branches. The province, if it's a large amount of money, the province had to, you know, report to the central headquarters in Beijing. But with these local state banks, they don't have headquarters to report to. Okay, I'm the boss. You know, I can make approval within the next week or so. And also, these local state banks have been, with the help of local governments, they have been even welcoming local real estate sectors to become their shareholders. So Evergrande, you know, the big real estate firm that was in trouble recently, was the biggest shareholder of Shengjing Bank, you know, which is another local state bank in Liaoning province, my home province. So this sort of, being the stakeholder thing has further made the whole two sectors further deeply intertwined. This is the, the head of the real Evergrande company shaking hands with the, I think the party secretary of Shenyang, where Shenzhen Bank was located. When I was writing my dissertation, I had something missing, and that is regulation. The question is, why didn't Beijing regulate? Because Beijing knows that given all the strategies that these local state banks have used to expand their markets, there are a lot of risks concentrated in these banks. Think about the real estate firms in China, because the connection is so deep, and once the real estate firms run into trouble, these local state banks should also run into trouble. So for the book, I try to sort of fit in this missing gap. I've been talking to, and I'm still in the process of talking to regulators in China, which is very hard now. I regretted not having done that a few years ago. Either in person or through WeChat is very hard. So basically, the story seems to be the case that there are two eras of financial regulation in China, which I think is consistent with the story that I just told. So what this graph shows is that this is the total number of warnings and punishments issued by the Chinese Banking Regulatory Commission over time. The commission has changed its name a few times, but basically this is sort of the total number of bank punishments issued by them. So basically for 2014-15, there weren't many numbers of punishments, or a few 500 or so punishments or warnings issued every year. So these punishments or warnings were targeted at bank branch level. So considering the fact that China has so many branches, this is really like small peanuts, basically. And things have changed really dramatically at GDP. So basically, the first era, and I quote from one of my interviewees, he was because in the beginning I thought maybe there was some data problem. Maybe you guys were not recording things. He was like, no, this is a era of great development. And regulators in China back then, they aren't really regulators. I think they should be called developmental regulators, because they were given the task to, on one hand, they were trying to regulate, but on the other hand, they were trying to promote financial development. We're trying to think of ways for these banks, if you know China, there's quite a bit of you won't be surprised about these local collusion stories where regulators help these banks to bypass central regulation to set up yet a new branch somewhere else where they should not. So this is really an era of great development where regulators were not hard at all at the banks. This is also consistent with the story, with the grand bargain story, because the central government promised localities that, look, you can do whatever you want. All I care about is my central revenue. So I tend to think that the central government itself purposely left the regulatory system weak. At least it wasn't functioning as hard regulators at all. So starting in 2015, so there was the first spike of, rising from about 500 to almost 2,000. That's a big jump. So what happened in 2015? So 2015, there was a stock market crash in China. on June 15th. So if I plot the data by day, then I see, this spike was right after June 15th. June 15th is Xi Jinping's birthday. So he saw that, oh my gosh, some people are trying to manipulate the financial system to create some sort of financial coup d'etat against me. So after that, things have changed very, very dramatically. Especially when he was, after 2000. So this is the 19th Party Congress, and then later on was the 20th Party Congress. So as he was trying to consolidate power, and China entered the second phase. Strengthening regulation, preempt financial crises. So this is also the period when Baoshan failed, because the regulatory pressure is just so high. But the Baoshan story, there are other stories where de facto bank failures happened, but there are different ways in which local governments have been handling these failures. Baoshan is peculiar, especially in the case that rumors say that it involves high-level elite politics. Because Baoshan's major shareholder, the Tomorrow Group, in one of the pictures I showed in the beginning, Tomorrow Group was claimed to be closely associated with the Jiang Zemin family, and so the bank was Jiang Zemin faction bank, so it was crashed really hard in 2019. So this is just a more sort of granular way of looking at the punishment data sets. So these are the big national banks and some of the so-called joint stock banks in China. So basically, we see after 2014-15, all banks, for every year, every bank, they always get warnings and punishments. But before that, there are years where, they were left alone. But when we look at the local state banks, the pattern is even clearer. A lot of these local state banks, these are the names of the banks, right? So Weihai Bank, whatever, Ningbo Bank, and so on and so forth. A lot of these banks, despite their aggressive market expansion behaviors, they were basically left untouched. And yet, starting from 2015, it's like they're getting hit hard year by year, every year, almost every year. They get, so this. I think this says a lot about sort of the intensification of regulation in the Chinese system. I think I'm getting a little tired, so it's the right time to conclude with some final thoughts. So, as I said, in 2014, Ning Lardy wrote this book called Markets Over Mao, he argued very optimistically that, basically, markets is now over Mao in China. Markets is driving resource allocation, and the private sector is getting more loans from banks. Everything looks great. This is where economists would, predict China should be after so many years of reform. But only a few years later, he changed course completely. Oh my God, the state is now shooting back. Basically the argument is that no, Mao is still over markets. Mao is still over markets. And in this book, he shows new data that state-owned enterprises, SOEs, are still, once again getting more lending from the banking system and so on and so forth. Where Back to the Future, everything has changed. And then I was like, which Lardy is correct? How did he change course so radically? Is it just simply because Xi Jinping? I don't think so, because I think a lot of Chinese scholars have really especially economists, missed what market means for the Chinese Communist Party. Yeah, Sarah would agree with me because of her own work. And I came across this great quote from Deng Xiaoping, you know, the Chinese greatest Chinese, well, I wouldn't say greatest, but Chinese reform architect. He said that market is a tool of the state, just like planning is. So this is how the CP sees market. The party has been, so the party state has never sought market reform in the hope of creating a market-dominated system, in particular strategic sectors such as banking. And so basically, when we think of competition in this kind of market system, especially when we think of banking system, competition is not just simply organized around profits, but it's also organized around the sort of the changing political objectives of the state, the central state as well as the local state. And when these objectives of the state change, I would say the dynamics and the dynamism of such a market also adapts, also changes. So we really shouldn't be surprised to see this back and forth between markets over Mao over markets, because the hope has never been to create a market that dominates the state. So in this system, especially in the banking sector, we should never, ever expect the kind of market development where private banks, foreign banks play a big role. As long as the party state is in power, that should not happen. We should also not expect large-scale failures of Chinese banks because that's politically unacceptable. So I would say that in such a system, creative destruction isn't there, but creative reorganization is a key feature of this sort of market system, because think about how Chinese banks exit the market. It has to be organized and approved by the government. And the governments have been, when you think about how Chinese banks fail, it's a process. For example, the case of Baoshan is a process very well managed and organized by local governments. Different bureaus, different SOEs, who should be taking care of what, who should be taking care of Baoshan's branches outside the province, what should happen first and next. The market exit process is controlled by the state. I should stop here and take questions from you. Thank you very much.